Our next guest is Benali Hamdache, who is the Green Party of England and Wales' is migration spokesperson and also a councillor in Islington, and a long-standing member of the Green Party of England and Wales, well known amongst the membership and also a long-term friend of Bright Green. We're going to be talking about the government's current migration policies, what the Greens' response would be. But before we get into that, Benali, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. It's been a long day with Remembrance Sunday, but an important one. So yeah, it's good to have today.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Benali. So I'm going to kick you off straight away with the first question. So at the moment, in the current political context, you've got both the Tories and the Labour Party who seem intent on trying to outdo each other on anti-migrant rhetoric. And also on policies. You've got the Rwanda deportation policies, proposals from Labour to introduce ID cards. How should progressives be responding to this current cacophony of reactionary rhetoric on migration?
Yeah, well, it's all hauntingly familiar, isn't it? I worked in the migrants' rights sector back in 2014, and there's lots of echoes from that time, starting with Yvette Cooper back as Shadow Home Secretary once again. Now, I think centering the rights of refugees and migrants is really important for our politics because they are the canary down the coal mine. I think as soon as politics is ready to sacrifice and attack and other one group of society, it's a warning sign for how the rest of politics and the rest of priorities will be shaped. And yeah, and again, Keir Starmer's Labour Party seems very much ready to abandon the more progressive approach that we saw under Jeremy Corbyn, which still wasn't perfect. It wasn't as good as the Green Party's approach, but was much better compared to Ed Miliband. And yeah, I mean, ID cards this week. Now, Yvette Cooper quite quickly said that the Labour Party were going to back off that idea, but I think we have to really focus in on what that messaging piece told us about where Labour is. ID cards were suggested as a way of making sure that the hostile environment was better enforced. It's about keeping undocumented migrants out of work, unable to use bank accounts, unable to use to rent. And if we look back at where the hostile environment policies come from, they were originated as a term by Liam Byrne under the last Labour government. So unfortunately, there is this authoritarian strand within the Labour Party that is coming at the forefront, and I think we have to expose it and we have to challenge it. I think there is a fight within the Labour Party. There are more liberal attitudes, and I think we shouldn't be afraid of welcoming and celebrating when Labour get it right, right? Like they are going to scrap the Rwanda refugee deal if they are back in power. That's really important. But they are very much arguing on a kind of logistics and financial argument. They're not arguing on the moral principle that it is simply wrong to send people to Rwanda. And yeah, I mean, the Tories, I mean, ultimately, we've seen the Tory party hijacked by their far right kind of movement from within, long gone. Is this idea of this one nation Tory party? You've got some really unpleasant characters that are at the forefront of Rishi Sunak's government, whether that's Suella or other characters. And I think actually what is heartening is that both this hardening rhetoric from both parties is increasingly out of step where the public is, from human homes for Ukraine to public polling. The British public have never been more supportive of the rights of immigrants and migrants. And I think now is the time to start getting the Green voice out there that we are the party that has the progressive policies that the public are looking for.
So you've mentioned, I guess, the public attitude towards migration at the moment, and if we were having this conversation 10, 15 years ago, the context then was you looked at opinion polls, and opinion polls were constantly saying that migration was one of the top issues people cared about, and when they were saying they cared about it was because they wanted lower migration. You couldn't knock on doors 10 years ago without, you knock on 15 doors and at least one of the people there would mention migration as an issue. That definitely seems to have shifted, and you look at the public opinion poll and that has happened. But So, with regards to some of the policies that are coming out of the government, some people have argued that things like the Rwanda deportation policy, it's not it's not a serious policy proposal, and indeed we've not seen deportation flights taking off yet, partially because they've been resisted by legal challenge and campaigners. But some people would argue that it's not a serious policy proposal. What it's designed to do is to whip up kind of hostility towards migrants and to use migration as a culture war issue, rather than as a serious proposal when we're looking at migration. What do you make of that suggestion?
I think there's levels of things going on. I think one of the things that I've been doing is working with our Green MEPs in Europe who have been visiting Manston, asking civil servants questions, challenging some of the decisions that they're making. I think one of the biggest interesting bits of insight that I glimmered from those conversations most recently is that for lots of civil servants and high up decision makers, this is simply replicating the Dublin Third regulations. So this was a deal under the European Union where under certain rights you could send migrants back to the first country of origin. Now, so the Conservatives have cooked this up, this slightly bizarre sense of logic where Rwanda is just the new version of Dublin 3 because Europe won't take back our asylum seekers. So we'll just find another third party to do that. So there's some very kind of warped logic that equating someone being sent to Spain is just someone being sent to Rwanda, which based on human rights, based on the deal having to be negotiated, based on the plight of refugees in that country, is absolutely not the same. I think also, very clearly this deal came out when it was all about saving Boris Johnson's job, right? It was Operation Red Meat. They were dealing out hard right politics as quickly as possible to save Boris's job and distract us all from Partygate. It's very clear that Boris Johnson was calling up Priti Patel asking, what about Rwanda? What about Rwanda? I mean, by some newspaper reports, Rwanda was actually on a list of countries that shouldn't be looked at in terms of these deals. And it was from political pressure from Number 10 that it got back onto the list of priorities. So I think there are some civil servants who have cooked up some very warped logic based on the political priorities of saving the Conservative Party's bacon. But I think, unfortunately, there is some serious commitment to making this happen because having left the European Union and having lost the opportunity to work with our European neighbours to support refugees and work together, the as a result, civil servants are cooking up kind of half-baked schemes like this, and we're hearing Paraguay is on the list. The idea of sending refugees to Paraguay all the way from the UK is just, it's wild. I think we are witnessing a Conservative Party that has run out of ideas, has run out of oomph, only has the fight with itself and with Labour. And I think we're going to see some very strange things over the next 2 years before the general election kind of barked out, and some very strange logic.
So we've talked a little bit about policy and the impact of that. What I wanted to talk a little bit about is the impact of rhetoric when it comes to migration. So the policy conversation, part of it is the the conversation that we have is largely about rhetoric when it comes to migration. So you've seen recently Celeb Raven referring to migrants as an invasion, and we've seen similar rhetoric taking place across our politics in recent weeks. Um, I wondered beyond the kind of direct policy implications of the things that are being introduced, what do you think is the impact of the kind of anti-migrant rhetoric we get from government and the media and from politicians on the real lives of actual people, whether they be refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, people of color, and so on?
I've seen that, day to day in my life. I'm the son of an Algerian migrant, and in the wake of the Brexit referendum, he experienced some of the worst racism that he'd had in this country in decades. I mean, similarly, soon after the referendum as well, I had to go to the police to report 2 racist incidents on the bus. It did feel like politicians and certain parts of the media had given permission to the worst kind of behaviour in the public sphere, and yeah, I think when you've got politicians using utterly unacceptable language, there are consequences. And civil servants warned Suella that her language and her rhetoric risked giving a green light to far right extremists. And then we saw what happened with a terrorist attack against refugees in this country by a person who had clearly been radicalized online over a number of years. And I think politicians who are playing this game need to pause, and they need to think about the consequences of their actions. We've had two MPs killed in the service of their duty in the last decade. That is the direct impact and direct consequence of the polarization and the worsening of the public sphere. Refugees have much less security, much less help. We've got incidents of far right activists go storming hotels and videoing refugees, and it only takes a little bit more for that to turn into violence. I think politicians, we can inspire, we can provide hope, but our words can do the direct opposite. And I think it's deeply troubling to see where the Tory party is, and to see some of the rhetoric coming out of the backbench, the front bench, all in pursuit of trying to save what seems like a doomed attempt to not lose the next election. And at some point, you hope that maybe some morality and some sense that things are more important than an election, and that the fabric of society matters. But then you look to the Republicans in America and you realize that some politicians don't care.
So I've got a final question for you before I look to the chat and see if there's anything that we can pick up from there. So people watching, please do pop your comments or questions in the chat. So my final question to you is, looking forward, rather than looking at the kind of current situation we've got now and the awful things that we've talked about thus far, what would a humane migration policy look like?
Well, so I'm really proud. I mean, the policies that we have and the values that we have are actually one of the biggest reasons I joined the Green Party back in 2012. And actually, all over the world, the Greens are leading this conversation, from Australia to Germany to New Zealand and Sweden. So, Green parties have led the argument for a kinder and fairer process, and quite often challenged parties on the left to do better. Now, I think, first of all, it has to start with safe routes for people to be able to come to this country. The best way to put the people smugglers out of business is to let people come over to this country with permission and then claim asylum here. I mean, I think Canada is a good model to follow. They're not perfect, but they allow people to get visas to come claim asylum and do much better work than us. When you look at the Channel and you look at the Mediterranean, you see the amount of people dying or, deeply in danger because of the conditions. You can't help but struggle to wonder why we aren't opening up safe routes, when we know that so many people who are making the journey are refugees. They are fleeing desperate conditions. So safe, authorized routes is number one. I think number two, and this is something that I want to talk more about, is about an amnesty of undocumented migrants. Now, the Irish Green Party led on this in Ireland. So refugees who didn't have papers, or migrants who didn't have papers, who had been in the country for a long time, had a pathway to naturalize and to gain British citizenship, so Irish citizenship. We should be doing the same here. It allows people to come out from being exploited in the criminal market, from out from the cold, and pay tax, be part of society. This used to happen in Republican America, and it's not on the agenda here. And in fact, once upon a time, Boris Johnson supported an amnesty for undocumented migrants back when he was nicknamed some kind of liberal. But I think that it's something that we should be kind of champing in the bit at the Greens, because so often when we're debating migrants and refugees, we're trying to hold on to what we've got right, rather than actually for what, pushing the narrative and pushing the envelope on what policies might seem challenging now, but are absolutely needed. We need to invest in the asylum process. I mean, one of the most notable things under the Priti Patel's Nationality and Borders Bill was scrapping the target of how soon asylum seekers should get a response. Actually, people should be getting responses and answers much quicker, and we should be processing people so they get a decision and not wait years and years and years for some kind of decision on their application. I think also one of the things is that we need to reverse the hardening of the process as well. Another thing, a feature of the Nationality and Borders Bill, was that you the measure of evidence that you have to provide early on has become much higher. And we know that this government is deporting LGBT people back to places where it's illegal. We know this government is ignoring evidence of people being people trafficked. So kind of putting resource back and making sure that there's ethical processes to properly listen to people's cases. I'm really excited about the Green Party's rewrite of our migration chapter. And I think one of the ideas that is coming out of there is that anyone who has a job offer should get a work visa. I recently wrote for Left Foot Forward about how the transition from freedom of movement to the kind of short-term work visas that are kind of being put out to fill gaps in the employment sector are leading to massive amounts of worker exploitation. And we've got people in debt bondage who are coming over to work in farms in miserable conditions, who are vulnerable to their employer because they're here as sponsored by their employer. I think the Green Party have great principles about actually giving power back to the employee, working with trade unions and kind of relaxing some of the hardening that we've seen in policy. I mean, it wasn't long ago that international students were allowed 2 years to stay in the country after their degree to find work. That, again, I think that was Theresa May that was removed. So yeah, I think there is a kind of fairer approach. It's not too hard to imagine, but it's become so clouded by the kind of lack of courage from mainstream politicians. But actually, the hardening has only creeped in over the last few decades, and just peeling back some of the changes under New Labour and this Tory party would take us back to where we were. And it's sad that we've lost that.
So I'm going to go to questions from the chat now. So for people watching, please do stick any further questions in the chat whilst we've still got Benali with us. So Steve C asks, how would the Green Party build a system for end-to-end management and welcoming of migrants? So from reception to support into housing and work.
Yeah, so I think we need to change the approach that we've got that is very focused on detention. I mean, the conditions in Manston are absolutely horrifying, and they're done so deliberately. Now, most recently, the Home Office actually did a trial of asylum seekers being looked after in the community, and potentially people who are perceived as high risk. And the trial worked perfectly. I think we could be making sure that asylum seekers are not detained, that they're kept in the community. And there's lots of reasons why that's important. I mean, particularly for LGBT plus refugees who are expected to prove their sexuality and gender. And how do you do that when you've been kept in detention? How can you prove an out and proud life in those conditions? I think resourcing is a really important matter. I think the lack of temporary accommodation that's suitable for refugees and asylum seekers is a huge problem. Some of the quality of these hotels that people are being left in. I mean, the amount of Afghan refugees who've been in miserable hotels, moved around more than once, some of them not able to build any stability, it is absolutely heartbreaking. And so the austerity and the cuts that are behind this agenda have to be reversed, and we have to invest in this part of the public service. I think letting asylum seekers work is another really important part. I mean, actually, if the public are really supportive of the idea that asylum seekers should be allowed to work, and it allows people to build a life and not to be stuck in a hotel day to day with nothing to do, I think it's a really important part of welcoming and building people's lives. And yeah, I mean, I think The other bit that I would talk about would be the absolute pittance that asylum seekers are given every week. Yes, people are provided with accommodation, but the amount of money that wouldn't be able to cover travel, or wouldn't be able to cover like essentials like clothing, particularly during cost of living crisis. Just like benefits, it's been frozen for a long time, and are increasingly familiar with the impact of austerity on the welfare of people claiming benefits.
Benali, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's been an absolute pleasure and really fascinating, interesting, insightful as always. Thank you so much.
No worries. Have a good day, everyone.